Whether the Mongols of the Golden Horde availed themselves of this invention, we do not know. But Chinese printed pages were circulating westward. The first crude attempts at using type and inking and paper in Europe bear resemblance to these Chinese pages, which were printed only on one side. Messer Marco may have had a hand in this, because one Pamphilo Castaldi saw at Venice some books made from Chinese wood blocks, brought back from the East by Marco Polo, while Gutenberg was still a boy. The later work of Faust and Gutenberg was no more than an improvement on the Chinese process. Through the court of the Ilkhans and Egypt, knowledge of the eastern oil fields reached Europe to be ignored for centuries. Arab seamen showed the Europeans a strange invention that guided their navigation in fogs and dark nights, replacing a sight of the stars, a magnetized needle floating in water in a bamboo case. It came originally from China, where the south-pointing needle had been more than a curiosity. It had served to guide caravans across the barren parts of the Gobi, where landmarks did not exist. With this embryo of the mariner's compass came specimens of fine blue porcelain and delicate bronze from Chinese workshops. Such discoveries challenged the ingenuity of Western minds. It is hardly by mere chance that the age of inventions began in Europe when the early voyagers came back from Cathay. Kubilai began to remove himself from active administration as his age advanced. He built himself a new hunting lodge in the prairies and allowed affairs at Taitu to take their course. Being more desirous to prolong his own years, he had chosen his heads of administration with discernment and had the good sense, rare among autocrats, to let able men run their departments without interference. He loved his people, the Chinese chroniclers relate, and he had only one grievous failing. He placed foreigners in supreme authority over the people. Inevitably, this led to conflict, especially at the Kubilai's sons. As Kubilai's sons resented the influence of the foreign ministers, the conflict, however, burst around one individual, Ahmed, the adroit financier, had managed to make a fortune for himself, not much smaller than the treasure of Khakan. And Kubilai could not, or would not, believe this. Leaders of the Chinese faction acted to right the wrong. Instead of committing suicide, they killed Ahmed. Messer Marco was a witness of the event. The Khan held Ahmed in such esteem, Marco explains, that he could do what he pleased. This person had power to dispense government offices and pass sentence on evildoers when he wished to be rid of anyone. With or without just cause, he would go to the great emperor and say, "This one hath acted against your imperial dignity." Then the Khan would say, "Do what you think to be right," and thus Ahmed would have the person put to death. High rank did not safeguard anyone from him, because if a man were accused of crime by Ahmed, the accused could not bring testimony to prove his innocence. No one dared stand by him in opposition to Ahmed. More than that, if he desired a beautiful woman, he managed to get hold of her. If she were not a wife, he forced her to marry him. If she were married, he compelled her to submit to him. When he heard of a lovely young woman of some father, his agents would go to the father saying, "What do you say? Give this daughter of yours to the Viceroy Ahmed, and he will make it possible for you to have a certain office for 3 years." Then Ahmed would go to the emperor saying, "This man is a proper candidate for that office, which will presently be vacant." And the emperor would answer, "Do what you think to be right," and the father would be appointed to the district. The young woman would belong to Ahmed. Well, wives and husbands don't really belong to each other. It's more of a consensual agreement. But in this way, through fear of the minister, most of the beautiful women were at his summons, either to be wives or mistresses. Not only that, he had 25 sons who conducted themselves in much the same manner. This Ahmed had collected great treasure because men who wanted office made him heavy presents. In such power did he continue to rule for 22 years. The Chinese, wearied of bribing the minister and submitting to the dishonor of their women, decided to get rid of him. While Kubilai was off hunting in his new game preserve at Chagan Nor, where he had begun to raise partridges. The conspiracy was led by a certain Chenge, whose mother, wife, and daughter, according to Marco Polo, had all been possessed by Ahmed. A commander of an army division, Wang Chu, supported Chenge, and there was a sorcerer in the plot, which was aimed at an overthrow of the Mongol garrison in Taitu. At the signal of the lighted beacon, the Chinese were to take to the streets, which were cleared every night after the curfew, and kill all bearded men. This meant the Muslimin and the foreigners, and probably the Mongols. Fundamentalist Christians don't shave either, because the Bible puts no allowance for it. The putsch began well, and might have conceded if it had not been for the alertness of the commander of the Mongol Guard, Kubilai. Wang Chu and Chenge entered the palace at night. Marco relates, Wang Chu sat down in the hall and ordered a number of lanterns to be lighted in front of him. Then he summons a messenger to Ahmed, who lived in the old city, to summon him to the hall. He pretended that Ching Kim, the great Khan's son, had returned unexpectedly. When Ahmed heard this message, he was surprised, but he hurried toward the palace because he feared Ching Kim. When he reached the gate, he found Kubilai there, who was captain of the guard in the Khan's city. Where do you go so late? Kubilai asked. To Ching Kim, who has just now arrived. How could he arrive? Kubilai asked. How could he get in secretly without my knowledge? Because of this doubt, he followed the minister in with a detachment of soldiers. Now the idea of the Gathayans was that if they could get rid of Ahmed, they could manage the rest of it well enough. As soon as Ahmed stepped into the palace hall, he saw the lights of all those lanterns before him, and he bowed down hastily in front of Wang Chu, thinking him to be Ching Kim, and Chengi, who was standing by, ready with a sword, cut him on the head. Kubilai had stopped at the entrance. As soon as he saw this happen, he shouted treachery. Instantly, he loosed an arrow from his bow, wounding Wang Chu. At the same time, he shouted to his men to seize Chengi. Then he sent to proclaim through the city that anyone found in the streets would be killed without warning. The Gathayans knew then that Kubilai had an idea of the plot, and they no longer had their leaders, so they kept quiet in their houses. Kubilai at once sent riders to the emperor with a clear report of the incident, and the Khan sent back an order for him to investigate carefully and to do what he thought right about punishing the guilty. In the morning, Kubilai examined the Gathayans and put a number of them to death, those whom he found to be leaders in the conspiracy. After the great Khan had come back to Kambaluk, the city, he was anxious to find out all he could about what had caused this. Then he learned about the inquiries of Ahmed and his sons. It was proved that he and 7 of his sons, for they were not all bad, had forced innumerable women to become their wives, besides the ones they had ravaged. And Islam forbids acquiring women by force as such. Either by inheritance or otherwise, as Surah 4 makes clear. The great Khan then gave orders that the treasure Ahmed had gathered together in the old city be transported to his own treasury in the new city. It was found to be enormous. When the Great Khan realized this, he ordered Ahmed's body to be dug up and thrown into the streets for dogs to tear apart. Those of his sons who had been evil were flayed alive. Now, when all this happened, Messer Marco was there on the spot. Like all Messer Marco's narrative dictated years later to a French writer, when both of them were in a Genoese prison. This terse account of Ahmed's end is bald but true. Messer Marco makes no comment on the vigilance of the Mongol officer who stopped a state conspiracy in an hour, nor upon the amazing speed with which a report was written out, carried the distance of 2 days' ordinary march out of the city, answered by Kubilai, and the answer brought back, all between the early hours of the night and morning. So, dawn? Or do they mean that between the night and the morning? But, like mid-morning. Reading between the lines, we can see how reluctant Kubilai was to interrupt his hunting, how he had left a vitally important decision to his divisional commander, yet held an inquest of his own when at last he returned, and the laconic Venetian fails to tell us that he himself gave the evidence that the enlightened Kubilai as to Ahmed's character, because the Chinese annals of that year yield this evidence. The emperor, returning to Chengdu, desired Polo, assessor of the Privy Council, to explain the motives that had led Wang Chu to commit this murder. Polo spoke boldly of the crimes by which Ahmed had oppressed people, and which had made him detested through the empire. The emperor's eyes were opened, and he praised the conduct of Wang Chu. He complained that those who surrounded him had feared Ahmed more than they had desired to serve the interest of the state. Kaidu, Kakan of the Steppes. Ahmed's crime, it seems, was not that he had debased the currency of the empire, but that he had made a private fortune almost as great as Kubilai's. He was besides convicted after his death on a morals charged by Messer Marco's testimony. Straightway the astrologers in their towers for Kubilai by then had erected a second tower for the Muslim experts, predicted that Kubilai would find another Ahmed, and Islam, of course, does not allow this sort of, you don't tell the future, future telling tools and stuff like that. As such, that's not. He did this in spite of the objections of Qing Kim and the Chinese, who foresaw only disaster in withdrawing silver from circulation and in opening vast channels of speculation. The man appointed by Kubilai was Sangha, a Buddhist who succeeded both Fagspa and Ahmed. The first attempt to raise the revenues of the empire to the vast amounts of 15 million ounces of silver yearly failed by the opposition of Kubilai's sons and the mandarins. The advocate of this scheme was put to death. Not that Kubilai was merely avaricious or stubborn. His scale of expenditures had to be met by growing revenues. It is doubtful if he could have reduced his expenditures even if he had been willing to do so. And Kubilai saw no reason to do so. He demanded only that the mass of the common people be protected against poverty, and that the necessary revenues be raised by the minister. Accordingly, a new system was devised, a clever compromise that took into account Kubilai's heedless idealism, the opposition of the now conservative Mongol families of imperial blood, and the objection of the Chinese mandarins to a fluctuating currency. The new coinage was to be established, a kind of token money. The various treasuries would be empowered to mint and distribute copper coins worth little intrinsically, but with a fixed nominal value. This coinage would be paid out in relief payments to the peasants impoverished by drought or locust, and would also be used to pay foreign merchants. From the copper coinage, it was calculated that the emperor would derive a profit of 7 parts in 10, with a portion of this profit Grain reserves could be bought up and sold cheaply to the masses. Also, the government was to appropriate all forges owned by the noble Mongol families. With these forges, arms were to be manufactured and sold at a profit. And the government was to have a monopoly of the wine business. The tax on the sale of wine was increased. This is why alcohol and tobacco were taxed by America, right? Because they saw the precedent. To compensate the Mongol families, they were to be given the right to dispose of certain raw products of their herds, wool, hides, etc., at a profit of 2 parts in 10. This new scheme, like most compromises, accomplished little. A few years later, the paper currency had to be devalued to a fifth. Kubilai's treasury was kept filled and emptied at the same time. In compensation, the splendor of the ritual at the courts of Taitu increased yearly. On the feast of his birthday, thousands of the Mongol and Chinese nobility appeared in robes of cloth of gold. The pearls and jewels on such robes sent Messer Marco into amazed calculation. He estimates that some of the costumes were worth 10,000 bezants. But at this birthday festival, the nobles were expected to make gifts to the imperial treasury, ostensibly to the person of the Khagan himself. And the amount of all gifts was carefully graduated by the imperial assessors. The celebration of New Year's became a greater event. Then the imperial elephants were paraded in their housing, and the strings of camels, the assembled courtiers who, in a previous generation, had been the chieftains and noyans of the tribes, made prostration before Kubilai at the cry, "Bow and adore." They bow down, Messer Marco explains, in adoration toward the emperor, as if he were a god. Then they go out to the splendid altar which is decorated. They incense the altar with a golden censer, bowing to the tablet of vermilion with the name of the Khan inscribed upon it. Kubilai accepted such homage without protest. When one man is enveloped by the ritual of what's considered to be a deity, he must keep himself apart from his fellows. He is dependent upon those who carry out his orders, and they in turn can have no personal relationship to him. Not by any craving for ceremony, but by the inevitable process of Chinese ritual. Kubilai was being changed from a victorious Mongol Khagan to a benevolent son of heaven. It was impossible for him to free himself from the pressure of Chinese opinion. When he asked a commission of Chinese savants to explain the cause of earthquakes to him, he was answered in characteristic fashion. Earthquakes occur by 5 causes. First, when a monarch allows thievery to be protected. Second, when he takes too many women into his palace. Third, when he punishes too rigorously. Fourth, when the men about him intrigue against the public interest. Fifth, when he makes war thoughtlessly without inquiring into its justice. The change in Kubilai became more marked after the death of Ching Kim and his first wife, Jamui Khatun. From the far south, Bayan dared to send him a message of warning. In the years of Kubilai's grandeur, the brilliant general reminded him Kaidu had knit together the ancestral dominion of the Mongols in the steppes. Kaidu, in the beginning, no more than a rebel, had become the Anda of the descendants of the house of Chagatai. The elder Mongols had given him the title of Khagan. In the eyes of the chieftains of mid-Asia, Kaidu was the true heir of the house of Genghis. Kubilai had become a monarch of China. And 21 years after the outbreak of the Civil War, Kaidu made his most dangerous attack upon North China, an attack that seemed destined to succeed. Bayan was down in the tropics with the armies of conquest, and Kubilai himself had not taken the field since the surrender of his brother. This time the Mongols of the steppes had allies. The Manchu Tatar tribes of the Amur region were armed and moving toward the site of Karakorum. While Kaidu advanced eastward toward them from the Altai pastures, these two armies might invade the region within the Great Wall, or they might join forces at Karakorum. Already they had taken possession of the valley of the graves of Genghis Khan and the earlier Khans, a circumstance that disturbed Kubilai greatly. He sent couriers to recall Bayan with the army of the south. Knowing that Bayan would need time to make the march north, Kubilai ordered him to intercept Kaidu if possible. He acted himself with a decision that startled Marco Polo and the multitude of the courtiers, although first he took the opinion of his astrologers. Gathering all armed men in Taitu, Kubilai started a forced march to the north to strike the Manchu army before it could unite with Kaidu's. Rounding up his regiments of huntsmen and kinsmen with the imperial guard, Kubilai had himself transported at the head of this scratch army in its traveling compartment with the four-elephant motive power. He ordered the spearmen to ride behind the horsemen, and he lugged along a fire pa'au, or bomb thrower. For 20 marches, he crossed his yearly hunting grounds, and he gained touch with the rebel army somewhere near the Liao River. He was, with the advance, moving forward into the darkness, and when he found his elephants in the midst of the Manchu mounted units, he did not withdraw. On their part, the rebel commanders suspected that Kubilai's unexpected appearance was a trap, and they did not attack. By the first daylight, Kubilai's main body had come up, and Kubilai himself attacked, ordering the saddle drums to sound through his lines. Chanting to this music, which may have been the customary Mongol method of signaling in the near darkness, Kubilai's forces penetrated the rebel camp. The surprise of the attack was increased by the blast of the fire pa'au, which dismayed the Manchus. The Manchus. Kubilai gained a complete victory. An old man, incapacitated by gout, lying on his couch above his elephants. The rebel commander was taken and executed promptly, before anyone could beg for mercy for him. The Manchus retreated to their forests. Not until Bayan arrived with the emperor's field army did Kubilai retire from the campaign to celebrate his victory in the pavilions of Shangtu. Eventually, Bayan was able to force Kaidu back to the western pasture lands, and Taitu was not again threatened by the rebels. And when the great Khan had gained this battle, Messer Marco relates, all the people and tribes of the north declared their loyalty to him. The new frontiers. Actually, Kaidu was getting a firmer grip on the steppes. Bayan had to be summoned again to drive him off from the home pastures near Karakorum. He had knit together the lands of the house of Ogadai, his own, and the house of Chagatai, his empire in the unsettled west, served to separate Kubilai from the Russian and Persian dominions. So it was not entirely by his own volition that Kubilai was becoming an emperor of China alone. Barred from the west, Kubilai set about extending his frontiers in the other direction, up into the headwaters of the Yangtze, beyond the gorges, through the frontier tribes on the slopes of the Tibet Massif. One expedition penetrated as far as the Brahmaputra River as it felt its way toward India, only to be turned back by the impenetrable mountain ranges. Kubilai then sent other armies to go around the impregnable ranges by the edge of the southern sea. They brought back reports of dense jungles where the heat of the sky slew men, and of the elephant-riding people, and the forgotten temples overgrown by this strange forest life. And for the first time, Kubilai heard that his armies had been defeated. They had penetrated to Yunnan, where sickness and bad water had taken toll of them, so that the next season they were driven out. They had managed to overpower the elephant army of Myanmar, Burma, with flaming arrows, but they could not survive in such a tropical climate. Kubilai could not understand this. Years before, he had forced a way himself through the edge of Yunnan. Merchants brought him ivory from there, and rhinoceros horns and drugs from Tongking. He would not acknowledge that his armies could not bring into submission such lands which obviously were not defended by military forces as great as his own. But the jungle folk of Tongking were able to retire into their forests and harass the Mongols with poisoned arrows. It was no country for the maneuvering of horsemen. Kubilai, however, refused to believe that, and his stubbornness cost the lives of 2 favored generals. New armies were mobilized for this tropical front. 17 battles did not make the Mongols masters of the country. In the end, the lords of Tongking saw wisdom in making formal submission and sending a statue of pure gold to Taitu. There were silver mines in the hills, and gold and silver towers in Mian, and Kubilai ordered that the whole of the southern peninsula be brought into subjection. Although the regiments of his Alani had been massacred when they were drowsy with wine and heat in a city known as the River Guard. His Mongol generals struggled with the small brown folk who could not be penned in the open. Their fleets sailing down from Canton raided the Malaya coasts, and officers in disguise explored the distant islands of Sumatra. A Mongol fleet felt its way out to Java to invade the shore of that almost unknown island successfully at first, then to be checked and decimated in the forest. The casualty lists of these tropical campaigns grew to tens of thousands in each year. The result of it was that Kubilai could call himself ruler of Koryu, Korea, and Tibet, the Yao, Malaya, Sumatra, Yunnan, Tongking, Thai, Siam, and Pegu. But the Mongols were not able to colonize the tropics or to draw more than a slight tribute of treasure from them. At the same time, the Mongol armies tended to become more and more drafted contingents of foreigners, commanded by both Chinese and Mongols. A group of islands, little known then, refused to render any allegiance to Kubilai. They were called the Place of the Sun's Rising, Je Pen Kuo in Chinese, which we now pronounce as Japan, and Nippon in the native speech of the islanders. Korean merchants told Kubilai that the palaces of Nippon were plated with gold, while large rose-tinted pearls were drawn from the Nippon seas. Envoys were sent from Taitu to the Japanese islands with a conciliatory message. The Mongol power will be kind to you. It does not desire your submission more than that you should become part of the great Mongol Empire. The feudal and courageous warriors of Nippon did not even receive the envoys of the Khakan. After a lapse of years, Kubilai ordered the dispatch of a small fleet, which failed to subdue the outlying islands of Tsushima. Angered by this check and the heavy losses suffered, Kubilai prepared a greater armada. After a lapse of years, in 1281 of the Common Era, some 30,000 Mongols embarked in a great armada with twice as many Chinese and Koreans, and apparently took horses with them, and they accomplished little more than the Spanish armada against the English islands, landing and beginning to fortify themselves in camps. They were beset by feudal bands of warriors, experts with bows and long swords, and in no way terrified by the Mongol attack. Meanwhile, a typhoon scattered the transport junks, sinking the greater part of them. For some days the Mongols fought their way along the shore, trying to construct new boats. The attacks of the Hojos men exhausted them. The Hojos men exalted them. The Japanese put to death the Mongols who surrendered, and kept as slaves the Cantonese and Koreans, whom they thought to be slaves of the Khakan. There were few survivors. Kubilai ordered another fleet to be mobilized, while he sent bonzes to serve as spies in the adventurous islands, and the seamen of the ships threw the bonzes into the ocean. At the Korean ports, there was a silent rebellion against another expedition. Korean sailors deserted captains of war. Vessels turned pirate and made their own fortunes along the coast. Mandarins, who were to supply the fleet, held back the rice and money. Kubilai's generals warned him that there would be an open rebellion if he persisted in his attempt to send the fleet to sea. At last, even Kubilai realized the uselessness of another campaign, of another attempt, and yielded to advice. The constant campaigns had exhausted the Mongol soldiery. Kubilai at last contented himself with the homage paid him in the foreign courts. Yet the stress of the frontier wars had not affected the lands of China itself. The country, united under one unquestioned authority, prospered. While Sango wrestled with the ever troublesome finances, Kubilai occupied himself with letters. He had managed to have a new set of astronomical tables published. Now he watched the progress of printing at the Imperial College. He ordered work to begin on the Grand Canal at the Shantung end, while Bayan stayed at Karakorum to hold off Kaidu's raids. Kubilai made a journey on his elephants down to inspect the massive tombs of the Sung dynasty, his forerunners. When the Polos begged again for permission to return to the west, he released them from their long service, allowing them to serve as escort of honor to the Princess Kokachin, a maiden of 17. Messer Marco says with rare feeling for him, a very beautiful and charming person. Kubilai was sending her to Persia, where the Ilkhan Argun had lost his first wife, who came from the chestnut horse people, and so desired another to be sent him from the same stock. His envoys had approved the Lady Kokachin and welcomed the 3 Polos, who knew so much of the southern seas, because the war with Kaidu made the land routes hazardous with many detours. Kubilai routed them by sea. At last, Marco explains, he gave them all permission to depart from his presence. Kubilai urged Marco to give his greeting to the Western powers, and especially to the King of England, and then to return to Cathay. They sailed in a ship of state down the coast to Sumatra and on to the Indian Ocean. In the first moon of the year of 1292 of the Common Era, the dwellers in Taitu were troubled by an eclipse of the sun, a bad omen. Well, it's not necessarily a good or bad sign, but eclipses can cause headaches. So, the Chinese astrologers urged Kubilai to examine his conduct in those last months to propitiate heaven, and Bayan persuaded him to name Chingkim's son, his heir. In the 10th moon of the next year, a comet crossed the sky, frightening the multitudes. The Chinese astrologers warned Kubilai to examine how he had governed people. Instead, sick in his chambers in the inner court of Taitu, unable to visit the Green Hill or to ride forth on his elephants, Kubilai summoned Bayan back from the prairies to comfort him.